Intersectionality has been a part of my life since I lost my sight, which so around middle school or so, when I realized that it was going to impact me and impact the way that I experience the world and the way that people see me. I spent a lot of time trying to navigate those three spaces and not fitting well into any one of those, being the only Black person when I'm in the room with white women, and being the only person with a disability or only person who's blind when I'm with Black people. And really spending a lot of time trying to understand where I fit in for me, like, how do I reconcile these things about myself? And then how do I engage and interact with people so that they see me for who I am? That was always a part of my experience. However, I didn't want it to be my profession. Which is probably really interesting and ironic because that's what I do now. But I wanted to be an attorney, and I was an attorney. That was my original career, the path, and that's what I did. I was a commercial litigator for many years, and I loved that work. But what that work caused me to do and caused me to think about was partnership at a law firm. What does that mean to be a partner in a law firm and to be an owner? Because that's the way I looked at it. At a large firm, I wanted to be an equity partner. Like, what does it mean to own a piece of that institution? And when I looked at the legal industry as a whole, it wasn't just one particular firm, it was the whole industry. It didn't look like me. Right? It wasn't built for me. I saw anybody that looked somewhat similar to me, Black folks, women, women of color, not too many folks with disabilities, but there are some. I saw those folks leaving, right? I saw them not feeling like a part of it. And there were times when I didn't feel like I was a part of it. There were times when I'd appear in court and either the judge or opposing counsel would assume that I was, either the secretary or the defendant. And I didn't do criminal work. So, it was an interesting experience to have people, look at you in that way. So did I want to be and own a piece of that? And what I decided for myself was, I want to own and be a piece of the change, right? There's lots of great attorneys out there. But the perspective and the life experience that I have led me to do my own work and study of the laws of sociology and psychology around identity, and to use that to improve the workplace and to use that to improve people's experience. So that's how I came to this work.
Thanks, Angela and Vijay. Thanks, Victoria, for getting us started. So, like Angela and Vijay, I came to this work, and probably more like Angela, in a sense, because I wanted to use the platform that I've been able to develop as an academic to make a difference. I came to this country as an immigrant, as a teenager, so I have that experience of being considered other. I'm a Black man. Living in Southern California during the Rodney King riots, experiencing that upheaval similar to our current situation now. But really, I was devoted to sort of becoming a scientist and not really raising consciousness of diversity and equity. And it really came to my realization when I was in graduate school that I was the only Black one. And then it really hit me that we are so few and far between, particularly in STEM spaces, in science, technology, and engineering and math, that I started doing diversity work at the time as a graduate student without sort of anyone realizing or knowing, but continued to use the platform that I had as a developing scientist at the time and progressively through my career, to continue to advocate for those who were not being allowed, frankly, to do what I was able to do. And so that brought me to this long arc of where I am now, sitting here, speaking about these issues, where I was trained as a scientist, trained as an academic, but really realized that I personally needed to use my platform as those two entities in order to make a difference for those who don't have access.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like we've all kind of had that experience of being the only in different situations, and all of those interpersonal things that happen as a result of being who we are. what I realized lately is there's a much greater realization of the systemic racism that has occurred, over the last 400 years in lots of areas. So I wonder if we can talk about the difference between systemic racism and interpersonal discrimination. And Angela, maybe you can start us off there.
Sure. So the way that I like to describe the difference is institutional systemic racism is really about the systems and the framework, right? How things operate. We can go back to the Declaration of Independence, right? So when something says all men are created equal, who is that leaving out, right? Because people were left out, women, people of color, right? They were not even considered in that. So everything that built up around that just baked in discrimination and exclusion, right? So when we think about how laws are created and made, when we look at things like housing, so for instance, we zoom forward to the 1940s, 1950s after World War II, and we look at something like the GI Bill and how that was applied inequitably, so that Black veterans that came back from overseas weren't able to purchase homes, right? There was redlining in the real estate industry. You couldn't purchase homes. That is systemic racism. That's institutional racism. When the systems and structures and policies are not only not built for you, that they're built to keep you out, that's systemic racism. That's institutional racism. Obviously, both sides of this, right? The institutional racism and the interpersonal discrimination, prejudice, both of those are things that need to be worked on. But when we get at the systemic, it opens up more opportunities and more access.
I wanted to pick up on that thread that Angela sort of raised, and if we take this a step further, and we can look at something like test scores for access to the academy, and we say, well, why don't we just use test scores because they're on the face of it, they look fair. But then you ask, well, how do high school students prepare to take those tests? How are their high schools resourced? Are those resources derived from property taxes? And how are those housing developments developed? Some housing developments had covenants that explicitly excluded groups, particularly of color. And so we have to think about those systemic developments that happen in many cases generations ago that lead to differences that we see here today.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we talk about some of the systemic challenges that have occurred over many, many years. Now moving a little bit to higher education and thinking about how our existence in higher education has been impacted by some of that those systemic challenges. The question now is, what is anti-Blackness and how does it function in higher education? And Avery, I know you've started with some of the test scores. Are there other things that are impacted in the higher education industry?
So there's so many different ways in which this is intertwined within our higher education system in the U.S. It's as simple as faculty of color who advise many students of color that come into their offices who are not necessarily assigned as their formal advisees, but they spend a significant amount of time advising those students. Now, those faculty of color, they're 24 hours in a day. Our majority colleagues or white colleagues don't necessarily have those number of advisees. And so they're able to devote more time for their scholarship. But yet, it's not always recognized that faculty of color have this additional burden in advising students who come to their office. It's sort of a simple example. Another sort of more personal example, when students, particularly Black students in this case, are in a classroom and they don't do well, then it's an example of Blackness. If a white student does do well, it's just an example of another student who didn't do well. So again, we see this sort of built in what is the comparison. There are other examples. For example, what is our curriculum? From what framework do we teach? What is the reference point that we compare others to? These are all things that are embedded in what Angela spoke about in terms of the founding principles and how we actually evolved to where we are now.
Great, great. Other examples?
I think anti-Blackness in higher education, Avery, really, you did a great job nailing it down. And I think in terms of the student experience, when you really put yourselves in the shoes of a student who might be hyper minoritized, right? And so Black students in higher education are deeply underrepresented in their institutional life. And so there also is a real psychological risk associated with just being Black in this much of a context where you don't see yourself reflected in the faculty, in the staff, in any of the administrators that you can go to for help, and where your community is so small as a part of the student body that if you choose to try and spend time with your community, you're limiting part of your experience by not being able to access the fuller whole. If you try and access the fuller whole, you feel like you're constantly having to exist in spaces where you don't see yourself reflected. So in my frequent conversations with Black students at all of the institutions I've worked at, they talk about this conundrum of how to balance the desire to feel normal and therefore to be in a space where you are seen and felt and are in the majority, and how if you play into that desire all the time, then you're actually cut off from the majority of the experiences the campus has to offer you. And so the level of courage that it takes for Black students to thrive in white institutional racism is tremendous compared to the level of courage it takes for people who are completely centered in the experience. And I think that is an unnamed tax that Black students face when they attempt to pursue a baccalaureate degree in America, or a graduate education as well.
Angela, did you have something?
I fully agree with both what Avery and Vijay have said, that it's very challenging for students not to see themselves reflected and to have to navigate those spaces. It's really difficult to have a full experience of everything when it wasn't built for you, right? The systems, the programs may not meet your needs and may not see you fully as a person. So yeah, I definitely echo what Vijay says, and think that the experience of higher education for students and also for staff who serve students, we're really trying, and I think people try to serve as that example, but that is a lot of work. It's extra work beyond what's called for, but I think we all do it because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If we explore a little bit more in terms of kind of the systemic racism issues and the performance of students within our colleges and universities, do you see any particular things that stand out there? We did have a comment in the chat around the testing, which I think Avery mentioned. But it says the testing required to enter the higher education system, the ACTs and SATs, speak to primarily white middle class experiences and knowledge, which is absolutely true. Are there other things that you can think of that might impact a student's performance that are kind of these systemic?
Well, how much time do we have in this keynote? I mean, so let me try and boil it down to the most basic sense of how stacked the deck is against first generation students of color, right? So we know this empirically, that the single biggest determinant of your ability to complete a college education when you're born is the level of degree attainment of your parents, which already pokes so many holes in the idea of educational meritocracy. But why is that the case? And one of the reasons is that, and this is not meant to be comprehensive, but illustrative of the problem, higher education is designed self-referentially, meaning we design these systems to work for the people that run these organizations. So professors teach in the way they like to learn, super problematic. Administrators design programs that would be great programs for themselves, But if your administrators aren't either equity-minded or coming from marginalized and underrepresented groups, then what you're getting is the recreation of systems of dominance in almost every aspect of university life. So if you take something like freshman orientation, orientation is an onboarding program, right? Freshman orientation is supposed to be teaching you how to enter the university and be successful. But if you look at the curriculum or the learning goals and outcomes of the average freshman orientation at the average university across the country, what you see is that most of the hidden transcript for student success isn't being overtly explained to students. So there's some transactional academic advising stuff that happens, a bunch of peer networking, but no one is pulling the students together, and especially the first generation students of color, and saying, hey, this is what it means to go to a professor's office hours, and this is why you should do it. They assume that you know what office hours are and why you should go do it, right? But there's actually a tremendous amount of social capital involved in decoding why you would go to a professor. Why would you subject yourself to that? Well, actually, it's one of the best chances you have to build a real relationship with a faculty member that could potentially change your whole experience of higher education. And so that's just one tiny example of where we actually know, both in the literature and in the lived practice of the work, that there's a huge curriculum of student success, the ways of knowing and being and doing that result in degree attainment. But we don't take that knowledge and actually make it naked, right? Make it visible for marginalized and vulnerable communities. And so it remains something that you have to luck upon, or you have to have a mentor, somehow that you get that mentor that teaches you how to do it. And in these ways, we end up generating significant opportunity gaps in student performance, where not all students graduate at the same rate or graduate at all. And then we turn around and we use that data to say, oh, why are the students of color failing? Which is not the right question to ask. It's, what is the university doing that's promoting the success of historically privileged populations, right? And that's a completely different question that would put the lens back on institutional structures and ecosystems rather than on the vulnerable communities themselves.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that thread that Vijay very, very eloquently raised. This issue of, this hidden curriculum is one of the issues that put the additional burden on faculty and staff of color, because the students turn to those individuals who they see who look like them to try to understand and navigate the system. I mean, there are many examples published in the literature about the way we teach. As Vijay mentioned, professors teach the way they would like to be taught. Where if you do things like flip the classroom, minoritized students do better in STEM classes. Or if you change the structures and rules of how you actually develop your course, you can increase the performance of those students. So it's not that the students are not able to be successful, it's that the structure was not built in a way that allows them to be successful.
Great. So we have a question from the chat that's along these lines. So given faculty governments at the department level, how can institutions manage to move away from pedigree and test scores as key factors in recruiting students and faculty? So I know, Avery, you're involved a lot in recruiting faculty.
Maybe I can start there. One of the things about being in the academy and being a professor is this concept of academic freedom. And I think academic freedom is probably one of the most important things that we have in higher education in many universities. It allows professors and faculty to be able to work on things without undue influence, political and otherwise. It's a great opportunity, but sometimes it's also used to reduce our ability to make progress. So this idea of not relying on simple parameters such as testing is one that has been heavily debated more recently, both at the undergraduate level and the graduate level. But what it really means, in essence, if you boil it down, is we have to really evaluate the student, not proxies for where the student went to school, what resources the student school had, or frankly, what color they are. We really have to evaluate this, but that is harder work. It is harder work. And so therein lies one of the major problems. We have to be committed to doing that work in order to fully evaluate the student holistically, rather than relying on proxies.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, questions are coming in here, but I'm going to jump to a question that we actually had teed up originally. So what is the role of higher education in preparing future leaders to increase racial equity? So we get them, we have all these things that we need to do to get them here and have them be successful. Now, how do we prepare them to go off and do some of the work that we're talking about here?
Thanks, Victoria. I think that's a really key question. Given the role of higher education in preparing future leaders of this country, many of the networks that are developed that last for the lifetimes of graduates are developed during their years in college. Many of the lessons learned are taken and picked up and sort of practiced as they leave our institutions. And so, it behooves us as leaders of higher education to be preparing future leaders for this work of being anti-racist, for this work of being equity-focused and equity-minded. And what that means is looking at how we receive students. We speak a lot about recruiting students, but we also need to speak a lot about retaining students and ensuring that the structures exist, that they're successful, that we don't spend time just focusing on how many students we have, but are the students belonging in our institutions? Are they thriving in our institutions, and are they thriving when they leave? And that means, looking at the way we teach. That means looking at the way we actually develop the onboarding, for example, as Vijay mentioned, such that we don't have a hidden curriculum as to who is successful. It means really a comprehensive view of looking at the lens in which we've used to look at how higher education is structured for the last 400 years, and take a real close look at that lens and determine, is it working for everyone, or is it only working for the group that it was originally set up for?
I think that's just right. And I'll pick up on something that you said, Avery, as well as Vijay, about higher ed being self-referential. If we are responsible as higher ed for putting the leaders out there who are going to be leading, nationally and globally, that's beyond providing support for the minoritized or the othered students, right? It's showing all of the students what inclusive, equitable systems look like, right? Teaching them how and showing them why things are built the way they are, right? And why they should be built in a better way to be more inclusive. I think it's a broad question, and I think it's something that if we continue to be self-referential, that we really look at who's in higher ed now, we look at the students and start to shift that focus so that we're teaching all of the students a better way to build systems and a better way to lead.
Just to be provocative, I'll share a quote. I used to work with this really radical priest at DePaul University in Chicago, and he would say, sometimes people ask me, he was from Colombia and had actually fled the country as a refugee, and he'd say, sometimes people ask me, what is higher education like in Colombia? And he'd say, well, all of the leaders that we've had for the past 100 years have gotten their degrees from our premier institutions. And so the best way to evaluate what higher education is doing is the behavior of people who hold these degrees. And so he was making that comment given the extremes that he was referencing in Colombia. But I think that, to push here a bit, when we look at the intractable problems surrounding racial justice and racial equity in our country, when Angela said, racism and racial inequity was baked into the model right from the start. And the historical record's very clear on that. And people have been getting educated in universities in this country from the start. Not a lot of people, but in the last 50 years, more people. And yet we still struggle with some very basic questions like, does racism exist? How many times do we have to have this discussion? Or, well, I don't have privilege because I'm not a bad person. Or, slavery ended a long time ago. Why are people still talking about it? And frankly, the exhaustion amongst people who understand what's going on is because if you have college-educated people who hold these stances, frankly, in terms of a scorecard or a report card for racial equity, higher education is failing. It gets an F minus because we have all these people with college degrees that actually are missing some very elementary understandings of how the centrality of race and racism in creating American empire and in the maintenance of American empire, right? And so I think that there's a lot of room for growth in this space. And if we attack this problem as a cognitive problem, then we're going to be missing out on a significant portion of the equation. Obviously, I think there's significant need for curricular reform and pedagogical reform, so what we teach and how we teach, but there's also the need to rethink the question of whether colleges should be measured on transformation of the person. The reason that I work in the co-curricular and I identify as a student affairs educator is I think about one of the most important things my undergraduate experience gave me, which was a transformation of my personhood. And the vast majority of that happened outside of class. Because of my complex experiences in student organizations and residence halls and other spaces. And so are we also thinking about the transformation of the person in their co-curricular and the way that their personhood is actually what's going to probably shape their work and impact after higher education? And those are some potent spaces to be doing racial equity work as well.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that point, Vijay. And one of the discussions that has been happening, certainly at the graduate level, when we think about graduate admissions processes, particularly in STEM, where there's significant underrepresentation of minoritized populations, is rather than relying on sort of the final test, this GRE score or some standardized test, is to ask, what is the growth of that individual? Because that growth is actually a better predictor of how successful that individual will be at the graduate level as compared to a final test that that individual shows up with. And just to sort of add to that point, this growth can come where someone has the same score as another person, but they come from a college that's significantly under-resourced, but yet they were able to accomplish the same as somebody who didn't. And so that's much larger growth than someone who had more advantages and benefits, which, as Angela started out with, is rooted in this sense of racism.
I like that. Measure of growth or transformation. That makes a lot of sense. So we talked a little bit about some of the support structures that might be important as students from underprivileged backgrounds come in or first gen. I have a question in the chat, which I know we've all thought about, and I just wonder if we can have some reactions to. So, how bold would it be for Cornell to require all students to complete a course on structural racism in the US? And they go on to comment, I think this makes a statement as to the seriousness of how we hold the issue. I know we have, and I'll let you come, I know we have an IDP course, interpersonal
Dialogue project.
Dialogue project, thank you, that most students go through as part of the orientation. But this takes it a little further in requiring a course on racism.
Yes, so maybe I can quickly jump in here. So courses certainly exist at Cornell. I mean, we have a very rich course catalog that students can really take advantage of the expertise and resources that we have here. And so this is actually one of the things that I think institutions, particularly more recently, have been really looking at is, is our core course, set of courses, core curriculum, is it serving the students that we have? Does it provide the right framework? Does it provide the right context for where we are as a student body, as a country? And so I think this is probably the start of a long series of transformations that we'll probably see in higher education, where we'll really start to take a really close look at what we're actually teaching, how we're teaching it, and what lens we're teaching. And even if we have a course on, we have history of the U.S. courses. They provide the sort of proper framework, not always. And so we also have to ask what we teach.
Thanks, Avery. So I'm going to turn it back a little bit here to kind of the broader spectrum in terms of reactions to the recent racism that we've seen in the news, and just ask, what is the role of white people in this work? I think, Angela, if we could start with you.
I love that question. I love when that question comes up, whether it's a white person or a person of color asking it. And I think for me, the answer is to own this work as your own, right? That's the simple way of saying it, right? Racism, anti-racism, diversity, inclusion work, it's not the work of and for people of color or more minoritized people. It's the work, right? It is the work of people, of humans, right? We talk about creating systems. We talk about, the ability for us to innovate as a human race is what I'm talking about, is to innovate. And dealing with these issues, looking at systems, dismantling and rebuilding systems is the work of all of us, including white people. I'll also talk a little bit about, white privilege and power, right? So the folks who can really make the change, right, are the people with the privilege and power, right? Minoritized people can't do this alone, right? We've been talking about it, sharing about it, sharing stories, pointing out things. And I think we're at a really critical moment now where some folks who haven't been able to see it really see what's going on. And it's their role, and I would say responsibility, to pick it up and own it, all right? Feel what you need to feel, and then figure out how to dismantle what's happening. That's the work. That's the real work.
So something else we've realized, so thank you, Angela, is the protest movement has actually grown much beyond our own country to an international perspective. What do you think's driving that?
Maybe Vijay?
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at offering an opinion, and by no means is this meant to be an expert opinion, but an observer's comments. Avery and Angela, please jump in too. I think that, for me, as I watch video footage from London and from many major European cities, from South Africa, from Australia, it's very exciting. It represents a real moment of possibility. But it's also a reminder that for a few things. One, first, anti-Black racism is not just a US phenomenon. And the history of this is very clear, that in order to justify the transatlantic slave trade, European colonial powers had to weaponize anti-Black racism and spread it all around the world in order to create global consensus that chattel slavery should be a primary means of accruing wealth in the New World for hundreds of years. And so that's a pretty horrific history. And it's why you can go to places where there are no Black people and there's anti-Black racism, right? And I think about my own family in India. There are deeply held anti-Black beliefs in a group of people that have never met a Black person. How do you explain that? You explain it by looking at the legacy of multi-century British colonial influence in exporting anti-Black racism in order to create a color hierarchy in their colonies. And the second thing that I think of when I see these Black Lives Matter movements and racial justice movements around the world is that the irony at the end of this full cycle of colonialism, multi-century colonialism, is that labor follows capital, right? This is a classic political economy rule. So if you go to London right now, who do you see in London? You see people from all over the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is a kind way of saying all the countries that England colonized. And so you have people from the Caribbean, you have people from Southeast Asia. It's why London has some of the best food in the world. It's not the original food, it's the food from the colonies. And because people searching for work move towards the places where that work exists, which is where the wealth was aggregated for hundreds of years. And so all over the place, you have a diversification that came as a collateral consequence of colonialism and imperialism, and people moved right into subordinated slots in those colonial societies. And so countries like Germany have significant racial issues that have developed in the last 50 years because a migrant worker class came and got slotted right into second-class citizenship. Same thing in England, same thing in France, same thing in Australia and South Africa. And so when the movement that started in the United States really kind of lit the tinderbox of racial inequity that exists all around the world, that has been building for centuries. And I think we're in a real moment of possibility right now to try and affect some structural change and not just ameliorate people's anger with kindness.
Not just in the US, but internationally, right? Avery, did you have something?
Yes, I wanted to pick up on Vijay's point, and also perhaps maybe add, the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and that pandemic has revealed some structural inequities. And I say revealed because they've always been there, and people of color have experienced them, but not just in the U.S., across the world. And so, we have this intersection of the structural inequities in the health system that's been revealed by this pandemic, and the images that we saw on social media, on television, and in the newspapers of this sort of other structural inequity, this anti-Blackness structural inequity that cycles. There's a cycle. This is not new. And so I think there's a confluence of events that perhaps also happened there, where it's almost as these two things came together and triggered this sort of global recognition and realization that what we're really seeing is structural. It's not just this one-off, or this group is more criminal than this group, and that's why their interaction with the police are a certain way. It's that it's particularly based on the color of those individuals, and that color and the way those individuals are treated because of their color comes from these underlying structural inequity.
Absolutely. And I would say, on top of that is just where we are technologically in the world. That it's a much smaller place, and it's much harder to say that this is an isolated incident in this geographical area. People are moving, just like the COVID virus moved around the world in a matter of days, weeks. It's moving. I think with social media and technology, people are seeing this simultaneously, right? That it's not just happening in the US, it's happening in France. And people are connecting, and they're realizing that it's not limited, right? It affects all of us. It's a global issue. It's a human issue. And it's one that I think people are beginning to see really the depth and scope of what it is. And that, to me, is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for more people to get involved and really own the issue of taking on building anti-racist systems.
I just want to riff off that for a second, because I love the way that Angela and Avery are framing this. I wish that the two of you were shaping news media broadcasts and not the three major conglomerates that own all the news media at this point. But it's really frustrating when I hear the COVID reporting in the United States that very sort of sloppily says, well, there are certain populations that are extra at risk, right, for negative outcomes if they catch this virus. And those are people who are immunocompromised, people over the age of 65, and Black and Latino people and some indigenous people. And it's like, well, hold on. They're not intrinsically, it's not because they're Black or Latinx or because they're indigenous. This is by using that language, we're actually covering up the social determinants of health, the health equity issues that are driving the poorer outcomes, right? And so those populations are immunocompromised because of a number of health issues that are manufactured by structural oppression and racism, and that's something that gets obscured by the news media over and over and over every day. When they report on the statistics and they make it seem like there's something inherent. And I actually think there's a subtle reinforcement of racism in that, because populations get seen as lesser than, as opposed to understanding that the locus of the problem is structural oppression and not Black and brown bodies themselves. And I think that's a nuance that the news media needs to do a lot better job of unpacking, and higher education has an important role to play in pushing that dialogue.
Okay. So I'm going to turn it back to higher ed here a little bit. I've noticed, within our own university, in our own institution, that we took some immediate actions when we started to hear about some of these racial inequities. And a lot of universities announced actions that they were going to take. The question is, how do you move from these immediate response actions to strategies and tactics that change the climate overall and for the long term? We start with you on that, Angela, or Avery, I'm sorry, if you had you're ready?
Well, so yeah, maybe I can just take a first pass at it and hand it over to Angela. So one of the things we just had this conversation, this dialogue about sort of the revelation of these structural inequities around the health system, around the education system, and the other thing that we've been talking about is the cyclical nature of what we've seen. And one of the things I worry about is we're in the middle of another one of those. We're at the peak of one of those cycles. And it will go back to a trough where, so we go back to the way things are and nothing changes. And so I think this is really, we talked about the global nature of the movements that we've seen and the protests that we've seen. It seems to me that this is an opportunity to say, can we really finally examine the roots of all of this? And so I'm optimistic from that perspective, because I think that we've seen, based on the outcry, based on the requests for dialogue and engagement and conversation, that there's a more than I've ever seen. There's a need and a hunger to engage, at least in conversation. And I'm hoping that conversation continues and reaches to the roots of the things that we need to change, and then change them.
I think that's exactly right? So it's digging down and finding the roots. It's taking this moment, right? And there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of engagement, which is absolutely wonderful. And I think folks should, continue to stay engaged, continue to educate themselves, but also recognize, like Avery was saying, that, I don't want to see another trough, right? How do we take this and sustain this effort? Might drop down a little bit, but think about it as not this is the issue of the moment, right? This is the issue for the past several centuries. How do we keep it on our minds and in our actions going forward, right? So in order to do that, I think it's really important to, begin with knowing this is going to be for the long haul, right? This isn't a 6-month fix. This isn't a 1-year fix. This is looking at the roots, finding the roots, and looking at the systems. So figuring out where to start. So taking the issue in itself and really starting to break it down, right? And do an honest, this is me going back. My parents used to say, you need to take an honest self-inventory, right? And I think as institutions, we need to take an honest self-inventory, right? And really look from top to bottom throughout the entire life cycle of our populations, of our communities. So the life cycle of students, the life cycle of faculty members, the life cycle of staff members, right? How do they come into our institutions? What is their experience throughout the institutions? And how do they depart our institutions? And begin to really systematically examine, what are the gateways? What are these systems that are causing oppression, and then fixing them. Even if we lay it out, really quickly and really nicely, knowing that that's not enough, like having a great platform and saying that these are the 10, 15, 20 things that we're going to do means that that's 10 years worth of work, right? And being able to prepare and fortify yourself for that work, and really translating it from this awareness and knowing that it exists to figuring out what are the small and large changes. I think there's both that needs to be done, but figuring out what those are and charting a course, really mapping out how to get at this.
I would add one thing after Angela and Avery, both your comments were really inspirational, and I hope you are right. I hope we are in that moment of possibility where there is a fundamental shift, because we did see, right, the peaks and the troughs of the 20th century, and Angela, I hope we don't get another trough also. One of the challenges I see, just to toss a tiny wet blanket onto this inspiration, is this movement for fundamental reform in the race space is happening at a time when higher education is suffering financially more than any time in the history of the industry. 2008 had nothing on this. It is a unique storm of pressures facing this industry. And so that's one reality. And the other reality is that racial equity is expensive. And so what I would say to anybody that wants to embark on this journey is there's no way to do it without resources. Because what Angela was detailing is that it's not enough to open the door to the house and let people inside the house and say, now you're inside, you're included. That's not true. We know you have to rearrange the house. You need new furniture. The kitchen needs to be in a different place. The bathroom needs to work differently. If meaningful inclusion actually means that you change the structures, like Angela was saying, that costs money. It also means adding support services for students that, or staff and faculty that need the equity investments in order to optimize their outcomes, right? Equity on premise means treating people differently in order to optimize outcomes within existing systems. And so the challenge, I think, for higher education right now is how deep is the will of conviction on this set of issues, because it's not going to come without significant cost. And it's coming at a time when we're under the greatest strain in anyone's memory financially. And so that's going to be interesting to see if this turns into lasting change.
Thanks for that bit of realism, Vijay. I mean, I don't think it's a wet blanket. I think it's something that is really important to acknowledge and work through, right? So it reminds me of the Toni Morrison quote, and I'm going to get it wrong, but racism will end when it stops being psychologically and economically profitable, right? And that's a really hard thing to grapple with, right? Where and how institutions spend their money means something. It says something. It means something all the way down to the personal level. So I think it's a really important point to raise, Jay.
So just to take off on that question, if we do get the resources, and you guys all had some great ideas here, if we do get the resources and we're able to challenge some of these root causes around equity within higher education, what do we look like? How do we measure whether we've gotten there? What is success? Any thoughts?
Well, we've got some metrics that the three of us have been looking at for the past year. So I mean, we don't have to leave this in the anecdotal, and we don't have to leave this in the realm of just feelings. You can actually measure for some of the inclusion factors that get you beyond composition. Okay, yes, you have this many percentage of people here, but do they actually, are they having an equitable experience? And so you can attack this problem empirically by looking at their belongingness index, right, which is a measure of how people feel valued and supported within a space. Angela really astutely introduced the concept of perceptions of fairness, right? So does the average employee or staff or faculty member or student feel like their environment is fair? And fairness serves as an indicator of actually a number of other issues going on in a space when you have low perceptions of fairness. And so, you have variables that you can use, and there's many. I think, we've tried to be pragmatic and focus on a few in our studies at Cornell, but there's variables you can use to measure for whether populations are thriving. And we've actually been better about doing this in the student space, I think, than we have been in the employee space. Students are heavily studied in higher education. We over-survey them. We have tons of data. We don't always use that data to produce insights and use those insights to produce action, but we've got the data. And so, per the question, what do things look like? I think one of the ways we would know whether we've arrived or not is when if you look at survey data of marginalized and vulnerable group members, whether that be students, staff, or faculty, and if they have really high levels of belonging, really high levels of perceptions of fairness, whether they tell their friends and family, you got to come work here, you got to come study here. We've all experienced something negative. You don't tell your friends to go see that movie if the movie sucked, right? So we know that there are some pretty good ways to estimate whether people are flourishing in an ecosystem, and I think that we could use those factors to look at whether an institution is racially just and equitable.
Makes a lot of sense. Any other thoughts on that one? That was probably a question that I kind of threw out. I did have a comment that I will read in the chat, which kind of goes along with what you've said, Vijay, in terms of the way we've started to measure the climate here at Cornell. But it says a systemic study done by each college and then the university in total will be a great first step in making positive and lasting change. to tell us what are we doing wrong, what are we leaving out, etc. And then there's a question here, given the push for change and the pressures in financing coming at the same time, what do the panelists think of what used to be called target of opportunity efforts to diversify faculty? Avery, that might be one for you, given your
experience. So, you know, the interesting thing about target of opportunity is the academy has been doing this forever. You read about the history of how Stanford was founded, for example. They targeted Cornell and recruited their faculty as a target of opportunity. So this is nothing new. We only get nervous about this when we talk about individuals who come from backgrounds that haven't been traditionally looked at as targets of opportunity. So I personally see nothing wrong with using targets of opportunity because we've always used it. And I think that there are some legal frameworks that we can again when we think about this in practical terms. But I think using initiatives like targets of opportunity in order to illustrate the value that the institution places on faculty who bring a particular perspective, who can work with the students that they have. I mean, if we look at our the undergraduate student population here, we're almost, if not quite, majority minority students. But yet our faculty don't reflect that. So as an institution, do we value the fact that we can provide those students with the opportunities to interact with faculty who come from their backgrounds? So that's you know, sort of one example of how uncontroversial targets of opportunity is.
Yeah, I think that's right, Avery. And it's really about expanding our definition of target of opportunity, right? It's like what white men are judged on what their potential is, right? While minoritized folks are judged based on what they've already done, right? So looking at target of opportunity as not just shifting around faculty from elite institutions, right, to looking at where are the faculty that have things to add, right? What's missing? How do we expand target of opportunity and what we value and need as higher ed institutions? I think that's where we'll begin to make progress.
Great. So we have about 1 minute left, and I'm just going to throw out the opportunity for any last minute comments. I would think about kind of next steps, any advice on that, or anything that we may have not covered. Anybody?
Maybe just a one or two sentence. I think again, I really would like to leave this conversation in a way that this is an opportunity for us, and as a generation, I really hope that we take advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah, and what I'd say is that this is an opportunity, but it's also a challenging opportunity, right? Where it's not going to be easy to say that this is what we need to do, and we're actually going to put what we need and the resources behind it to do it. It's an investment, right? It's an investment in our values. What do we value, and what are we willing to do to get there, to begin to realize what our values actually are? So I see this as a tremendous opportunity, but it's not an easy opportunity.
Great.
I guess I will say that it's been really challenging going through this time of societal unrest in a virtual environment. And I think that it can get really easy for higher education administrators, if any of you identify in that way out there and that are dialed in for this keynote, or if you run companies, if your people are not with you, you can feel sluggish in your response to their demands, their agitation, their activism. And that's one of the potential threats in our current moment, is that the normal feedback loop between the various constituents of a university or an organization and the people who lead that organization is a bit fragmented right now because of being in virtual and being distant from one another. And so I would urge everybody there out there who feels like they are a change agent and are advocating to keep up the momentum until you're back in person. This is a long game. It's a moment of opportunity, but in order to actually manifest this change, It has to be a sustained effort of continuous mobilization, organizing, pressure, thinking, and innovation. And so I know for us, there's going to be some good thinking and planning in the summer, but the action is going to be in the fall. And I think that I look forward to that and hope that it develops sustainable change.
Great. Well, thank you. So this has been a really interesting conversation. You guys are awesome as always. So thank you so much for your insights and perspectives. And also thank you to the audience for being here. Your participation and engagement really is a sign of hope. And hope, I think, is only the beginning of what needs to be done for change in this environment. So we look forward to moving forward, seizing the opportunity, as our panelists have mentioned, and hopefully we'll be able to do something similar to this again. So thank you.